The vote was not close. Vel watched the affirmation tokens drop into the tally basin one by one, each one a small flat disk of bioluminescent coral, the Council's ancient theater, preserved across 10,000 cycles of galactic governance because the founders believed that consequential decisions should have weight, should make a sound, should be felt by the chamber as they accumulated. 11 disks. The basin glowed. The 12th seat, Sarathi, remained dark. Ambassador Prethvask did not place a token. The chamber's attention moved to the Sarathi delegation box the way a current moves around a stone, not stopping, not acknowledging, simply redirecting. Prethvask sat with his scales at full copperdark, the color of a Sarathi who has decided something and made peace with the consequences. He was the oldest serving ambassador on the council. He had held the Sarathi seat for 62 cycles. He did not place his token. The convener did not ask him to. What happened next happened in the formal language of procedure, which is the language councils use when they want an act of violence to sound like administration. The convener announced the motion carried. Announced the issuance of Directive Omega, authorizing preemptive Class 7 sterilization of the Sol system and all registered human territories, to be executed within 40 standard rotations. Announced that implementation would be coordinated through the 3rd Rapid Reaction Fleet, the 9th Border Enforcement Armada, and supplemental vessels drawn from 7 member state militaries. 340 warships. Vel counted the ventilation pulses in the gallery ceiling. The system cycled every 4 pulse counts. He had been counting since the 7th token dropped. Prethvask was escorted from the chamber before the convener finished the procedural close. 2 council security officers. No force, none was needed. Prethvask walked between them with the bearing of someone who had expected this outcome and had decided his objection was more important than his comfort. His eyes found Vel in the gallery as he passed. He said nothing. The ventilation cycled. Vel kept counting. The mobilization orders went out inside the same rotation. Vel watched them process through the station's administrative feed from the gallery anteroom, the text scrolling in the angular glyphs of Council Standard coordinates, fleet staging points, approach vectors, timeline. Clean. Thorough. The Council had drafted this document carefully. 14 months of committee work visible in the precision of its language, the completeness of its contingency clauses. Contingency for human non-compliance, proceed with primary sterilization sequence. Contingency for human military resistance, proceed with primary sterilization sequence. Contingency for human appeal to council law, motion is not in order, proceed with primary sterilization sequence. The Sarathi had a concept, Cyrac, that did not translate cleanly into council standard. The closest rendering was something like the rational grace of accepting a correct extinction. It was not a surrender. It was a recognition that when the mathematics of survival produced a clear verdict, the dignified response was to read the verdict clearly, to not flinch from its meaning, and to step toward it without the indignity of futile resistance. Sarathi philosophy held that Cyrac was among the highest expressions of a sapient mind. The refusal of it, the irrational, thrashing, undignified refusal, was considered a kind of cognitive failure. A regression. Homo sapiens, Vel knew, were rated at Tier 3.7 sapient development. Their fastest ships crossed a distance of 11 Veth per standard rotation. Their military capacity was logged at roughly 60 registered warships, aging, half of them patrol weight. They had 17 registered colonies, mostly extractive, none fortified. The mathematics of Cyrac were not complicated. Vel pulled up the long-range sensor feed at standard habit, not urgency, just the particular restlessness of a diplomatic observer with nothing left to observe, and found something in the Sol approach corridor that made his thermal pits go wrong. Not a ship. Ships. Human vessels. Not 60. Not their registered fleet. More. Moving in formation, not the scattered, reactive formation of a fleet scrambling to a threat it had just detected. Something else. An arrangement with geometry to it. Deliberate. Waiting. Vel stared at the display for a long time. The ventilation cycled. He forgot to count. The emergency bulkhead sealed before Vel reached the docking ring. He heard them go, the deep, pressure-shifted percussion of maglocks engaging through 37 consecutive blast doors, a sound Council Station Vareth had not made in Vel's lifetime, a sound that meant the station's automatic defense systems had classified an incoming vessel as a threat and locked everything between the hull and the interior to prevent boarding. Standard protocol. Sensible. The vessel that docked was a human diplomatic shuttle. Vel established this from a secondary monitoring terminal in the corridor outside Base 7, where he had been heading because Base 7 contained the only emergency communication array the blast door sequence had not sealed off from power, and Vel needed to reach someone, his superior, the Council Security Office, anyone who could explain what the long-range sensor feed had shown him. What he found on the terminal instead was the docking log, updating in real time. Shuttle registration, TSV Meridian Annex, Diplomatic Class, Seoul Confederacy Foreign Service. Weapons scan on approach, negative. 1 occupant. The blast doors had locked for one unarmed diplomat in a shuttle the size of a cargo container. Vel's scales had begun their shift toward ash while he was still reading the sensor feed in the anteroom. They were 3/4 of the way there now, the copper darkening out of them in patches, the pale undertone spreading from his jaw down his throat. He noted this the way he noted the ventilation pulses, as data, as something to track, as a thing to look at that was not the sensor display or the docking log or the question of how many human ships were in the Seoul approach corridor and how long they had been there. The interior door of Base 7 opened. The human walked through it carrying a thermos. She was not tall. This surprised Vel, though he knew the surprise was irrational. He had reviewed human physiological data, knew their average height range, knew that Homo sapiens displayed significant individual variance and that size correlated poorly with their capacity for damage. She was compact in the particular way of humans who had spent significant time in variable gravity environments, her movement carrying the unconscious ballistic efficiency of a body that had learned to negotiate space without assuming the floor would always cooperate. Her suit was civilian-grade diplomatic dress, Confederacy blue, bearing the small embroidered insignia of the Seoul Foreign Service on the left breast. Her hair was pulled back from her face. She looked, to Vel's thermal pits, like a source of steady heat, not elevated, not the bright spike of fear or aggression, just even. Continuous. She looked at Vel. "You're Sarathi," she said. "Yes." "Good." She held up the thermos. "You drink anything?" "This is coffee. It's not going to make sense to you, but I've got a long wait and I'm not going to have it cold." Vel's taxonomy processing cycled and produced nothing useful. Threat assessment, unclear. Tactical posture, none visible. Behavioral classification, nothing. The field remained empty. "I am Vel," he said. "Third Diplomatic Observer, Sarathi Delegation. Adiz Okafor. Seoul Confederacy, Foreign Service, First Contact and Sustained Relations Division." She found a section of wall that was not a blast door and put her back to it, sliding down to sit on the deck with the ease of someone who had sat on many floors in many emergencies and had stopped finding it undignified. She opened the thermos. The smell that came out of it was dark and complex and made Vel's chemical sensing nodes register something they had no classification for. "You're not going to be able to reach anyone for a while. The comm array in this bay is operational, but everything routed through the main dish is down. Our people are precise about that kind of thing." "Your people," Vel said, "disabled Council Station Vareth." "Surgically," Okafor said. "Life support is fine. You're not in danger." She poured a measure of dark liquid into the thermos cap and considered it. "The station's weapon systems are offline. The communication arrays are down except for localized short range. The docking clamps on 16 of the 17 bays are non-functional, which means no one's leaving in a hurry, but you're also not being held hostage, exactly, because if you really needed out you could spacewalk to an emergency pod from Bay 12. She looked up. Bay 12 is 3 corridors that way. Vel looked in the direction she indicated. Then, back at her. "Why," he said, "are you telling me where the emergency pods are?" Okafor drank her coffee. "Because I'm not here to hold you. I'm here to deliver something and wait for confirmation that the right people have seen it." She reached into her jacket and produced a data chip, standard council format, the kind used for official diplomatic transmission. She held it out toward him. You're the senior Sarathi present. That's close enough. Vel did not move. The thermos sat between them on the deck. Vel's thermal pits tracked its heat, steady, consistent, a small warm thing in the middle of a situation that had stopped making thermal since 20 minutes ago. He kept tracking it. It was easier than tracking Okafor, whose temperature had not changed since she walked through the door, whose hands were steady, whose breathing was, he checked, slow. Regular. The specific rhythm of a body that was not afraid. We have known, Okafor said, about Directive Omega for 11 months. She drank her coffee. Vel's scales completed their shift to ash white. The data chip contained no demands. Vel had expected demands. Some part of his processing had been building a framework for demands since Okafor sat down, calculating what humanity might ask for, what concessions might satisfy them, what face-saving language might be constructed to walk the council back from the edge of a directive it had just voted into law with 11 tokens in the basin. He was a diplomatic observer. This was the shape of his training, the structure his mind reached for. Here is the crisis, here is the lever, here is the negotiated path through. He loaded the chip. There was no lever. What the chip contained was a record. Complete, indexed, cross-referenced, annotated. Every council communication about Directive Omega going back 14 months, further back than the council's own drafting committee had existed, further back than Vel had known the directive was under consideration. Intercepted transmissions, committee notes, member state correspondence, logistics planning documents, fleet movement pre-authorizations. All of it. Organized with a thoroughness that made Vel's taxonomic mind itch with something he could not immediately name. Then, he reached the annotations. They were written in a dry, clipped register that he would later understand was a particular kind of human professional humor, the gallows variety, the kind that emerged from people who had been staring at their own potential annihilation for nearly a year and had decided that if they were going to do it, they were going to do it without the indignity of panic. Next to the council's projected timeline for the fleet's arrival at Seoul, they're going to be so embarrassed. Next to the sterilization contingency clauses, we flagged 6 technical errors in this document. We're not going to tell them. Next to the member state military contribution tables, note, the Vethdi destroyer class has a known sensor blind spot at 14 degrees off the port nacelle. Filed under, their problem. Vel read for a long time. Okafor refilled her thermos cap and did not speak. The clinical part of Vel's mind, the part that processed incoming data in the taxonomic frameworks of Sarathi diplomatic training, kept reaching for the concept of Cyrac and finding that it applied to everything in this document except the humans who had compiled it. The council had offered humanity the mathematics of their extinction. Clear, complete, unambiguous mathematics. 40 rotations. 340 warships. The numbers were not close. Humans had received those numbers. Had read them. Had understood them. And had written jokes in the margins. He was near the end of the document when his eyes stopped moving. The last entry was not a communication intercept or an annotated logistics table. It was a piece of physical media that had been scanned and appended to the end of a 3,000-page intelligence dossier. A small piece of what humans called paper. Vel recognized the material from xenocultural files, covered in thick, waxy marks in several colors. A drawing, crude in the way of juvenile human art, 2 figures standing on a curved surface meant to represent a planet, and, above them a scattering of marks meant to represent stars. Below the figures, in a child's handwriting, 6 words. We're still here. Love, Amara age 7. Vel's thermal pits returned to it again and again. The scan was high resolution. The paper had been warm when it was scanned, the thermal signature of a hand that had recently held it was visible at the edges, the ghost of Okafor's grip preserved in the document's metadata. He looked at Okafor. Your child? My niece. Okafor was looking at the display, not at him. She drew it for me before I shipped out. She knows I work in space. She doesn't know. She stopped. Finished her coffee. She doesn't know any of this happened. Vel looked back at the drawing. We're still here. Sarathi did not have a word for what a child wrote when she assumed, without question, without doubt, without the slightest shadow of having considered the alternative, that of course they were still there, that of course the stars were still above her, that of course the universe had continued to function as promised. The Sarathi concept closest to it was Threlveth, the confidence of ignorance, and it was not a compliment. It implied a mind too limited to perceive its own precarity. Vel looked at the drawing for a long time. He was not certain Threlveth was the right word. He was not certain his language had the right word. The fleet dropped out of transit on schedule, exactly as the Council's orders specified. Vel had partial comms by then, the short-range array Okafor had mentioned, patched into a relay that gave him one narrowband feed from the outer approach corridor. Not enough to reach the Council. Enough to watch. He stood at the terminal in Bay 7 and watched the fleet's transit signatures bloom on the sensor display, one after another, the massive thermal flares of vessels pulling back from faster-than-light travel registering across his pit organs even through the hull of the station, even at this distance, 340 points of sudden heat in the cold dark outside Seoul. The largest military mobilization in Council history. Vel counted. He stopped at 342 and accepted that the number was approximately correct and that approximate correctness was the best available data. The human formation was already in position. It had been in position, he now understood, since before the fleet arrived, since before the vote, possibly since before the directive's final drafting, certainly since before the Council believed humanity could have known to position anything. 170 vessels. Less than half the Council's numbers. Not arranged in a defensive line, not dispersed for evasive action, not concentrated for an offensive strike. Arranged. That was the only word Vel's training offered. The formation had a shape to it that was not tactical in any framework he recognized. It was geometric in a way that suggested deliberate visibility. The humans wanted the fleet to see them, wanted the fleet to read the shape of their positioning, wanted the shape itself to communicate something before a single transmission was exchanged. 3 Council advance scouts had been dispatched before the main fleet arrived. Standard protocol: clear the approach, confirm sensor data, identify any obstacles. All 3 were present in the sensor feed. None of them were moving. Their weapons signatures were offline. Their drives were offline. They were drifting in perfect condition, fully intact, their crews unharmed. Vel confirmed this from the lifesign telemetry, simply stopped. The way you stopped a clock. The mechanisms intact, the hands still. The fleet's lead admiral hailed the human commander on open frequency. The response came in 37 seconds. Not a voice. A data package. Compressed, large, transmitted with the calm procedural courtesy of a diplomatic submission. The fleet went still. Not hesitation, Vel knew hesitation, had seen fleets hesitate at unexpected obstacles, had seen the particular quality of military uncertainty that preceded a formation shift or a tactical recalculation. This was not that. This was something that had no military word for it, something closer to the way a body goes still when it has processed information it has not yet finished understanding. 19 pulse counts passed. The ventilation in Bay 7 cycled. Vel counted the pulses. Lost count. Counted again. The Admiral's transmission to the Council came back as a single word. Verify. Vel turned from the terminal. Okafor was still sitting against the wall. Her thermos was between her hands. She was looking at the ceiling with the expression of someone waiting for a long process to finish, patient in the way of a person who has already done the hard part and is now simply living through the interval between action and consequence. What was in the package? Vel asked. She looked at him. What do you think was in it? He thought about the dossier. The annotations. The margin note, they're going to be so embarrassed. He thought about the advance scouts, stopped like clocks. He thought about the formation's shape, visible, geometric, deliberate, and what it communicated before words. Not weapons, he said. No. A demonstration of capability. Partly. Vel's scales had been ash white for so long he had stopped tracking the color. He became aware of this now. He noted it. Filed it. Tell me. Okafor turned the thermos in her hands. When we found out about Directive Omega, we had a choice. Build a bigger fleet. Try to outgun 340 warships with whatever we could put together in 11 months. She considered this the way someone considers an option they discarded long ago. We're not stupid. We knew what those numbers meant. 11 months, 60 registered ships, 17 colonies. A small motion that Vel's xenocultural training identified as a shrug, a human gesture of deliberate minimization. The math wasn't favorable. No, Vel said. So we didn't build ships. She looked up at him. We spent 11 months making ourselves impossible to remove. Not militarily. Actually impossible. She paused. You know the Chethari famine relief stations in the Outer Rim? The ones that have been keeping 400,000 Chethari alive for the past 3 cycles? Vel knew them. Human-built, Okafor said. Human-staffed. Human supply chain. We didn't advertise it. She tilted her head. The Vrathi Deep Core Mining Consortium, the one that supplies 60% of the drive material for Council fleet vessels, including the 340 ships outside? Vel was still. Human engineering consultants on every extraction platform. Proprietary process. Not transferable. She set the thermos down. The Sarathi Long-Range Communication Relay Network, the one your diplomatic corps has used for 40 cycles, stop, Vel said. She stopped. The ventilation cycled. He counted the pulses. Reached 11. Kept going because stopping seemed worse. The picture the data package had delivered to the Council fleet, the picture verify meant the Admiral was demanding the Council confirm before making any further decisions, was assembling itself in his mind with a clarity that felt, in some sense he could not taxonomically classify, like falling. Humanity had not built a wall. They had woven themselves through everything. Quietly. Systematically. Without announcement. They had spent 11 months making the galaxy's cost-benefit analysis impossible to resolve in favor of their extinction, because the cost of their extinction had become, through 11 months of careful and unremarkable labor, the cost of everything that depended on them. Which was, Vel was now understanding, quite a lot. The advanced scouts stopped like clocks. The formation with the geometric shape. They're going to be so embarrassed. How long, he asked. How long had you been doing this before Directive Omega? Okafor looked at him steadily. We've always done this, she said. We just did more of it when we found out. The fleet stood down before the next rotation. Vel watched it happen from Base 7, the formation shift, the gradual thermal bloom of ships adjusting heading, the slow and organized withdrawal to a holding position outside the approach corridor. Not retreat. The specific, deliberate geometry of an armed force that has received new orders and is complying with them in a way that makes compliance visible, that performs the compliance so that the other party can observe it clearly and understand what it means. The word verify had done its work. Prethvask was reinstated to the Sarathi seat before the station's comm arrays came back online. Vel learned this from the first transmission he received, 12 pulse counts after the array was restored, a brief formal notice from the Council Secretariat written in the clipped language of administrative correction, the kind of language used when an institution needed to reverse a decision without acknowledging it had made one. A special session was called. The Directive Omega mobilization was suspended pending review. Pending review was the language of a council that had sent 340 warships to sterilize a solar system and received the word verify from its fleet admiral and needed time to understand what that meant for the next 40 cycles of galactic governance. Vel stood in Base 7 and watched the fleet's thermal signatures rearrange themselves in the display and did not feel what his training told him to feel, which was the relief of a diplomatic resolution achieved. He felt something else. He did not have a precise taxonomic classification for it. The inner door opened. Okafor came back from wherever she had been. She had walked the accessible corridors of the station at intervals throughout the standoff, not nervously, just moving the way humans moved when they needed to think, using their bodies to process what their minds were working through. She looked at the display. Read the fleet's new position. There it is, she said. Yes. She began packing. The thermos went into her bag first, then the chip reader, then small objects Vel could not identify that she had kept in her jacket pockets. She moved with economy, not hurry, not celebration. The specific efficiency of a professional completing a task. Your shuttle will be cleared to depart, Vel said. The docking clamps on Base 7 are, I know, she said. Your people sent me the all-clear 6 pulse counts ago. She stopped packing. Looked at the data chip on the terminal where Vel had left it. Did not pick it up. You can keep that, she said. The council will receive their own copy through official channels. Vel looked at the chip. The drawing, he said. Okafor reached into her bag and produced it, the original, not the scan, the actual piece of paper with the waxy marks and the 6 words in a child's handwriting, slightly creased from being carried, warm from her hands as she held it out toward him. He took it. It was lighter than he expected. The Sarathi worked primarily in crystal media, in data-dense materials that had weight and substance, that communicated importance through their physical presence. This piece of paper weighed almost nothing. He held it between 2 fingers and felt the warmth of it, the residual heat of Okafor's grip bleeding slowly away into the recycled air of the station, and thought about a child on a planet that had been, for the past 40 rotations, the subject of an authorized Class 7 sterilization order, drawing stars with waxy pigment sticks and writing "We're still here" because it had not occurred to her that there was anything else to write. She doesn't know, Vel said. She'll find out someday, Okafor said. When she's old enough. She picked up her bag. I'll tell her someone kept it. Vel looked at the drawing. At the 2 small figures on their curved surface. At the marks above them that were stars. There was a word in Sarathi's Sirak for the rational grace of accepting a correct extinction. Every species Vel knew had an equivalent concept. He had checked, over the course of his diplomatic career, compiled a small personal study of the ways different sapient cultures named the dignified acceptance of correct loss. It was, across the galaxy, nearly universal. The mathematics of survival were the mathematics of survival. A rational mind read them clearly. He had checked every species he knew. He had not, until today, fully reckoned with what it meant that humanity was not among them. Not because they couldn't read the mathematics. They had read them. They had read them, annotated them, found 6 technical errors they hadn't bothered to report, and spent 11 months making the mathematics irrelevant. The child did not know how close she had been to being wrong. She had drawn the stars and written that they were still there, and she was right, and she did not know what it had cost to keep her right, and she had not asked, because it had not occurred to her, because humanity had apparently decided, somewhere in whatever deep irrational architecture produced their behavior, that the children should be able to draw stars and assume. And had then proceeded to make that assumption survivable. Vel held the drawing carefully as Okafor's shuttle undocked, as the cold dark of the approach corridor swallowed the small vessel and carried it back toward the human formation, which was already beginning its own measured withdrawal toward Sol. He held it carefully and looked at it for a long time. He did not have a word for what he was holding. He was beginning to think that was the point. Prethvask asked Vel, later, much later, in the restored Sarathi diplomatic offices aboard the rebuilt station, over the warm mineral broth that was the Sarathi equivalent of whatever dark liquid had kept Okafor steady through the longest rotation of Vel's career, what he had learned. Vel considered the question for some time. I learned, he said finally, that we have a word for accepting extinction with dignity. Prethvask waited. And they don't, Vel said. And I have been trying to decide, for some time now, which of us evolved correctly. He did not tell Prethvask about the drawing. Some things did not require explanation. He kept it in the inner pocket of his diplomatic coat, close to his thermal organs, where it stayed warm. He checked on it, sometimes, when the mathematics of any given situation began to look unfavorable. It helped.